Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 3 of the Empire, Society and Modernity lectures on British history in the 19th and 20th centuries. As you know, this is the lecture that was cancelled because the term started 1 week late and we couldn't maintain the lecture in its normal week. So I'm going to discuss or talk about this lecture based on the PowerPoint slides that you can find on Amitis. So I encourage you to download those in order to listen to this lecture. And you can, if you wish, use this lecture as your starting point to work on the TD that is on the Great Exhibition. And you can hand in the work you've done to your tutors if you want an evaluation. So, the Great Exhibition of 1851 is what I'm trying to talk about today, and I'm going to bring economic, social, and political history perspectives to this event. So let's turn to the first slide, on which you see a beautiful, big, well, I don't know if beautiful is the right word, but you see a huge building there, which is called or was called the Crystal Palace. Those of you who are interested in football will know that in London there is an area of London called Crystal Palace. There's a football team called Crystal Palace, and that is a reference to this building. So the Crystal Palace, as you can see, was set up in Hyde Park, so in the center of London, and it's a huge building, 564 meters long, which is about 15 football pitches, and it was 33 meters high. That's extremely high, and it's because they had trees inside that grew. It's an iron structure and a glass structure, so iron plus glass. That's why it was called the Crystal Palace. And what was remarkable about it was the time it took to build, only 9 months. Using 5,000 workers, yes, but only 9 months to build such a huge structure. So the architect behind it was a man called Joseph Paxton, and he had successfully bid to make this enormous building to the organizing committee of the Great Exhibition of the works of industry of all nations that had been championed by the King Albert, or the Prince Albert, who is the consort of the Queen Victoria, the couple that you see there at the top. Inside this huge building, visitors could contemplate 100,000 different objects from 32 different countries. And half of the objects came from Britain, the other half, and Britain's empire, and the other half from the rest of the world. It was a huge popular event with 6 million visitors in 6 months. Okay? So 1 in 4 Britons saw it. At the time, 1851, the event impressed contemporaries in the United Kingdom, but also everywhere in the world. And so the question today is, why was this event so significant? Why did it have such a cultural impact? It's very important for me to highlight that it had such a big impact, such a cultural impact, that even today, so we are more than 100 years later, more than 150 years later, the British population is still aware of the Great Exhibition. You still have people who mention it on the news. They will talk about the Great Exhibition to compare contemporary events with a big, famous past event. Okay, so to understand why the event was so significant, I'm going to do what I've done with the other lectures: start with a presentation of the event and then go back in time to understand why it made such an impact. And we'll need to consider three developments that took place before 1851. So first of all, we're going to talk about the monarchy. And I'm going to show you that the monarchy before 1851 was deeply unpopular. Okay? And that's going to change with Victoria. The second thing I want to show you is that Britain was the first nation to industrialize. And that's going to have its importance when it comes to this exhibition. And finally, the third thing I want to talk about are the class tensions. They were deep and they were rife inside British society, and those tensions meant that people saw Britain as a potentially revolutionary country. And so the Great Exhibition will be remarkable also in that respect, that all classes will come to the Great Exhibition and no revolution would take place. Okay? So we're going to talk about those three developments now. So if you turn to the following slide, which is called background, it gives you the outline for what I'm going to say. So 3 points. First, an unpopular monarchy. Secondly, heading the first industrial nation. And this industrial nation is thirdly fraught with profound class tensions. So let's start with this idea of an unpopular monarchy. So if you go to the slide that is numbered number 6, you see 4 portraits of different rulers, or in the case of Caroline, the queen, so the wife of the king. So we have 4 figures: George III, George IV, William IV, and Queen Caroline. So I'm going to take them in order, starting from the left, and George III. So we have a king in George III who's on the throne between 1760 and 1820, which is a period in British history where a number of major events take place, not least, of course, the Napoleonic Wars, but also the war in the United States of America for the independence of those states from Britain. And the king at the time is George III, who suffers from it's a genetic disease. They didn't know that at the time, but that was discovered afterwards. Something in his genes unfortunately made him lose his mind, and so he became nicknamed Mad King George. And so from the year 1810, he's no longer on the throne. His son is the regent. So his son, George IV, is the regent from 1810 to 1820, and when his father died, George became king. Okay? So George IV, was deeply unpopular because he was apparently quite a nasty character. And the tensions around George would crystallize around his marriage. Now, this is one of those stories where I like to tell my students that really they should stop watching Netflix and just read some good history, because this is better than any sitcom or any series you can imagine. So here we go. The so-called Queen's Affair, which animated the country, was linked to the marriage of George to Caroline. So George IV and Caroline got married in 1795 because George was broke, Caroline was rich, and so he married her to pay off his debts. They had a daughter after 9 months after their wedding, so clearly they had at least had sex once. That's the idea. But they hated each other so much that they immediately lived apart from one another. And this was public knowledge. Everybody knew this. And the public were on the side of the Queen, because George was such an unpleasant character. In 1810, remember, George III, having gone completely mad, his son becomes the regent. And at this point, being the regent, George decided that he was going to limit Caroline's access to their daughter. Caroline fought back using the press, so she wrote pamphlets defending her right to see her daughter, and she was supported by politicians who were Whigs. Remember, the political parties are divided, or there's 2 big political groupings. One of them is the Whigs and the other is the Tories. The Tories are in favor of the monarchy, and they're in favor of keeping the monarchy. Within the Whigs, you have a mix of people who are not against the monarchy, but might be against specific rulers if they think they're too conservative, and other politicians who are in favor of a republic, who would be quite happy to see the end of the monarchy. George fought back against the pamphlets that were being circulated in the press by leaking details about Caroline's life, which were, basically details of her sexual life, which was obviously it's a very old tactic that we are very familiar with in the age of Me Too. When a woman accuses you of being a jerk, you accuse her of being a slut. It's the typical move of all abusers everywhere. So that's what George did, but it backfired. The public were still much more in favor of Caroline, even multiplying her support. The famous novelist Jane Austen, as you can see in the notes, wrote to a friend of hers, "Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can, because she is a woman and because I hate her husband." Okay? But in 1820, George III died, and George IV was to become king. Now, George didn't want Caroline to become queen, so he asked Parliament for a divorce, to pass a divorce bill. This move was so unpopular that it raised huge objections in the press, in Parliament, but also in the streets, to the point that the government felt it had to remove the bill, and this was this was a bill that was under such public scrutiny that when the bill was removed, people celebrated in the streets to the point of getting so excited that they smashed some windows of cabinet ministers. But George was still determined not to let Queen Caroline come to his coronation, and so he gave orders to the guards to refuse her entry to Westminster Abbey. And so when she appeared at Westminster Abbey, they slammed the door in her face. She responded to this by raising her voice, by being very angry, by making a scene, and this led the public who were there to turn against her, to boo and hiss because they felt this was undignified. A month later, Queen Caroline died, and George, being the nice guy he is, declared that this was one of the happiest moments of his life. Okay, just a charming, charming man. Okay, so that's why the monarchy was unpopular. First, with George III, he had become diseased and went crazy. Then his son had this big public scandal and acted in ways that are very unpleasant in public towards Queen Caroline. And when George died in 1830, it didn't get much better because he was replaced not by his daughter, who had passed away giving birth, unfortunately, to a child who was stillborn, so there were no inheritors in this line. He was replaced by his brother, William IV, who by this stage was an old man and proved to be a weak and indecisive ruler who was having a hard time taking decisions. The only position he took that was a strong one was his opposition to the Great Reform Bill of 1832 that I talked about in Lecture 1. So this contributed to further making the monarchy unpopular, the fact that the monarch would be against a reform that had support within at least a majority of the country. And when he died in 1837, he was succeeded by an 18-year-old woman, his niece, Victoria. So before I move on to Victoria, just a quick note. There are lots of dates on this slide, but you don't need to remember all of them. You need to remember what's important. What's important is that 3 successive rulers were unpopular for different reasons: disease, scandal, and unpopular positions on, opposing the popular will. And that's what counts, that you have a series of rulers over a long period of time, right, between 1800 and 1837, or maybe 1810 and 1837. That's almost 30 years of rulers that are successively felt to be unpopular. Okay, so what does that mean for this new queen? If you turn to the next slide, I'm sure you will agree with me that it's not surprising that people might have had some doubts in 1837 about this new ruler. She's 18 years old, she's a young woman, and well, not only is she young, she's also a woman, which of course would have led people to have doubts, even more doubts about her abilities, given the ideas about women's abilities that were present at the time. What changed, so people in 1837, there are people that are convinced that the monarchy is coming to an end, that the rise of this 18-year-old young, inexperienced woman is a sign that everything is going to collapse. Some radicals are even saying that the Reform Bill, the Great Reform Act of 1832, is the first step towards the end of the monarchy, which is just an old and outdated institution. But in 1840, so 3 years later, Victoria married her cousin. I shall pass on this. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And this young man was a modernizer. He was somebody who was deeply interested in industrial change. And very rapidly, as you can see, in 1844, he became the president of the Royal Society of Arts. This was a new society that had been created to encourage the arts, manufacture, and trade. And it was only called the Society of Arts before Albert became interested in it, and because he became the president, it became the Royal Society of Arts. What he did was immediately put his authority and his influence behind a project that this society had, a project for having an industrial exhibition that would be similar to, but much better, of course, than the French one. The French had organized one in 1844, and this society said, well, we can do better than the French. We can do something much better. He launched the event, the campaign for the event, in 1850. On the 21st of March, 1850, he gave a speech at Mansion House where he said, we're going to have a great exhibition to promote peace, love, and ready assistance, not only between individuals, but between the nations of the earth. So as you can see, there's massive ambition for this project. And it was, for the monarchy, an opportunity to align itself with the forces of the forces of innovation, the forces of commerce, instead of its usual associations, which had always been with the forces of land ownership. So the monarchy had always been aligned with the aristocracy. By championing this great exhibition of industry, they were aligning themselves with the social classes most closely aligned with industry and commerce, that is to say, the middle class, upper middle class, and the workers who are involved also in those industries, though of course the people benefiting most from it were the middle class. Okay, so that's the state of things regarding the monarchy. Why would it, as I said, why would they turn to the industrial classes? It's because they are the monarchs of the first industrial nation. So let's turn to the second section of this this rewinding that I'm doing, and turn to Britain as the first industrial nation. So if you look at slide 9, you see two tables and a map. Let's look at the first table. If you look at the first table and you look at the columns there, what you notice is in 1811, agriculture is 37% of gross domestic product in the UK. But 40 years later, that number has come down to 21%. And manufacturing, mining, etc. goes up from 27% to 40%. Similarly, trade and transport increase from 14 to 19%. Okay? So what you notice there is that agriculture, over that 40-year period, becomes the second sector of economic activity, and comes second to industry. Now, that trend of agriculture becoming a smaller sector of activity, what that means is that it's producing less wealth than the others. It doesn't mean that it's losing its ability to produce wealth. It means that the wealth that it's producing is less important than the wealth produced by the manufacturing and mining and construction. And if it's producing less wealth, that's because that's also one of the reasons for this, is because it's losing workers. The workers are moving away to the industries that are producing the most money, okay, the most wealth. Those industries are located near specific in specific areas, and they concentrate around specific types of industry. So in Lancashire, you've got the cotton industry, to the point that Manchester becomes nicknamed Cottonopolis, and where Lancashire is described as being ruled by King Cotton. In mining areas, such as in Wales or in the Midlands, you've got towns that just explode, like Sheffield and Birmingham. They were tiny towns, but because there's a mine next to, there's a mining industry next to them, they become huge towns because workers gravitate to these cities to have a job. The result of all this is a new map of Britain, where the north and the west become densely populated, to the point that they become counterpoints to the part of the country that has always been densely populated, which is London. So what you see with the final graph, if you look at the final little chart at the bottom, proportion of urban dwellers in 1850. In 1850, the UK becomes the first nation on the planet in which half of the population lives in cities. That's the first. As you can see, Russia at that point, it's only 1 in 10. France is 1 in 4. Germany 1 in 3. So the country that has the most people living in cities, the first urban country, is the United Kingdom. Okay, so the United Kingdom is the first industrial nation in the world, and that matters because it means they're going to have a bit of a head start when it comes to the new industries that are going to become the main drivers of the world economy. So if you turn to slide number 10, you see I have 3 slides I'm going to discuss now that are all called drivers of change. Now, I want to be very clear with you. It's very hard to describe the drivers of change of the Industrial Revolution, because I can't simply tell you a story of A causes B, causes C, causes D. It's not a simple line of causation from one driver to the next. All of these drivers take place in parallel with one another, and they have a tendency to accelerate the others. So each driver feeds the others. For example, the first driver, the demographic boom that you see at the top of the slide, led to, because there were a lot more people, the domestic market for, particularly for food, increased, and particularly for the consumption of meat. So that's going to drive the greater production of meat in the country. But that's not going to work. This production of more food, and particularly more meat, is not going to work if the agricultural system is not prepared to feed more people. And in the UK, they had, that's the second driver, an agricultural revolution by this time, which had prepared the agricultural sector to produce a lot more. So there were two main causes of this. The first is the enclosures. So enclosures in French, ce sont les enclos. So basically from the 15th century to about 1845, the British countryside was transformed because what happened was you had an agriculture that was based on collective farming. So basically the land belongs to no one in particular, but to the entire collective. So all the farmers of a particular area use the collective land and are all have equal access to it. It's called the common land. But from the 15th century, there are acts of parliament that are passed which allow certain individuals to enclose certain bits of land. So the land becomes privatized and individuals become farmers of their own piece of land rather than share the common land with everybody else. And this, one of the consequences of this is to push individual farmers to try and improve the yield of their own little piece of land. And so you have incentives to be innovative, to find new techniques to produce more. And those innovations are also brought to the farms by not so much farmers themselves as innovators in terms of machinery, some of them being farmers as well. So steam-powered machines come into the countryside, and with those steam-powered machines, like the one you have on the right, that were in the middle of the slide at the bottom, you have a steam-powered thresher, and so this, of course, increases the productivity of the threshing because instead of hiring humans to do it, you have this machine which is much more reliable than the humans at doing the work and can do a lot more work than the humans can do. So your productivity increases, which of course means you don't need the men anymore, so they are unemployed, and those men then go into the cities, and hence you get urbanization. These new machines that I'm talking about, again, would not have appeared without the third driver on the slide, which is banking, because you need a lot of money to invest in these new machines, into the making of the machines, the research that goes into them, the construction, and the commercialization of them. And this was made more feasible by the Act of Parliament in 1844, which gave the Bank of England a monopoly on the emission of money. So you now have a single institution that is in charge of the production of money, which simplifies and stabilizes the money market. They also, in the UK, developed in London something called the City of London, which still exists today, which is a part of London where you have the financial institutions. And in the City of London, 5 major banks emerged that specialized in short-term credit. And those banks became the principal sources of financing for innovators, for commercial enterprises or industrial enterprises. Okay? And again, all of that was further supported, further helped by the empire, which before the 1840s provided captive markets to British goods, because remember, before the Great Famine and the repeal of the Corn Laws that we talked about when I discussed this topic in Lecture 2, before then, Britain had a system of mercantilism, that is to say, a protectionist economic policy. Okay? So the empire itself creates bigger markets for all of these goods to be sold on. Okay? So let's turn to slide 11 to see the another series of drivers, 2 more drivers. of course, in addition to the three drivers we began with, there was the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution began at the end of the 18th century, and its principal characteristic was that it saw the invention of machines that were powered by steam, and these machines gradually were perfected so that they would increase little by little their speed. Okay, so coal, le charbon, became the main source of power and replaced wood as the main source of energy for these machines as they became more and more powerful and sophisticated. So the whole 19th century became associated with steam machines, trains or boats. And one of the most famous of these ships was the Great Western that you see there on the slide. The engineer behind the Great Western was this man who's photographed there, a man called Isambard Kingdom Brunel. What a great name, I have to say. Brunel was a sort of superhero or superstar of his time, in the same way that today Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs or Elon Musk are very famous for what they created in terms of digital innovations. He and other engineers were very famous for their constructions of bridges and boats and railways. Another famous engineer was George Stephenson, who you see below. What you don't see him, but you see his train, which was called the Rocket. It was called the Rocket because it went at 50 kilometers an hour, which at the time was seen, as you can see from the slide, was described as almost like flying, which of course to us is quite amusing given that our cars go much faster than that. So the train became, above all else, the key marker of the time. Just like we today, perhaps the key marker of our time is the smartphone. The key marker of the time was the train. So to the point that there was what contemporaries called railway mania. Railway mania. That is to say, people became a bit over enthusiastic for the railway. So the first steam-operated railway emerged in 1801. By 1830, you have 100 miles of track, and after 1830, there's a boom. So in 1831, 500 miles, but by 1850, 6,000 miles, which is twice as many in France as in France. And this railway mania had a number of positive but also negative effects that we will see now in the next slide. So let's have a look at the next slide. The effects of railway mania, first of all, on employment. It was fabulous for employment. 500,000 workers in 1846 were working directly on the railways. But there's also an indirect stimulation of the economy because these people working on the railways, they need iron, they need brick, they need gunpowder, and all this stuff is sold to the railway companies to make the train lines and to make the trains. In terms of trade, the railways had a very positive impact because what they do is they shorten the distances. You can't sell, if you're growing a tomato, for instance, or a salad, the salad can be sold on the market next to you, but you can't take it to the next big town where maybe there's a bigger market where you could find more customers. You can't take it because the time it would take you to travel there, the salad's going to go bad. But if you can diminish the time it takes to go there, then you might actually be able to sell your salad. So the market for goods increases for all products, but also the market, the foreign market grows for Britain because countries want this new technology. So they're going to buy these trains and their raw materials and their machines from the UK, where they're going to hire British engineers. And just to give you a local example, George Stephenson, who I was talking about before, he came to Les Ciotat in the Bouches-du-Rhône, next to where we are. He came to Les Ciotat when Les Ciotat was setting up its own train line between Marseille and Les Ciotat. He came to do the work on that train line, to be the engineer who oversaw it. For the financial sector, the trains were also a source of huge speculation and making of money, but also, of course, a source of huge economic instability. So because there's the railway mania, people invest in railways. They put their money, they pour their money into it, hoping to get great returns, because the railways are such money makers that if you invest in it, you're promised great returns, 5%, 10%. But of course, there's also a lot of people who are going to be cheated out of their money by unscrupulous lenders who tell you, yeah, it's a great deal, and then it doesn't happen, and you've poured your money into it, and you can't get it back. And so there are cycles of speculation where people lose their money. As you can see, there are 3 cycles in 24-25, 35-37, and 45-47. On land, the effect of the railway boom, of the railway mania, is excellent. That is to say, if a railway goes through, comes next to you, comes close to your house, this increases the value of the land on which you are, which of course is the opposite of today. If today you were looking for an apartment or a house and somebody said, well, I have a great opportunity that you can buy, but there's the train is going to be passing next door. Usually people don't want that, but at the time they did. Another interesting impact of the railway mania is the development of something completely new at the time called tourism. Well, new for the masses. So basically, tourism originally comes from the grand tour. That's where the name comes from the grand tour that aristocratic children would do. So a young man who is becoming an adult would go, a young aristocrat would go and visit various towns, big cities of Europe. And the idea being that if you travel in this way, you become a more enlightened young man, and it prepares you for life. So that's what the grand tour used to be. But in the 19th century, something called tourism is invented, where people who are not aristocrats will be able to travel, not necessarily to foreign countries, but just inside the UK. So in 1841, a company called Thomas Cook organized the first trip of people who wanted to go on this tour, this touristic trip, with something called the Midland Railways Company. And in 1844, Gladstone was in power, and he passed the Railway Regulations Act, which forced companies to run at least one third-class train each day. Why? Because that way poor people could also use the train. Because in the same way that you might have heard this argument before, in France, people regularly argue that we need to do something to make sure that everybody has access to the internet, because the internet has become a massive means of communication, of staying informed, but also of paying your taxes, of paying various things, of doing your banking. So everybody should have access to it, because it's become something that's so essential that if you don't have it, you are somehow excluded from the society in which we live, that you're not part of the society in which we live. Well, so it's a technology that everybody should have access to. The train in the 19th century becomes the same thing. It's such an important new method of communication and of transport that everybody should have access to it. And so the government steps in to force the companies to make it possible for people who are not rich to travel. And this leads to the birth of something called the Sunday excursion, where people who are not rich and who work every day of the week, on a Sunday, they could get on the train for a cheap fare and go a bit further, maybe to the sea if they don't live too far away, to have a little Sunday off with their family. And finally, of course, such a huge money-making machine and money-generating machine was bound to lead to corruption, particularly in the political system, because if you wanted to create a new railway line, you had to get the approval of Parliament. Which means that one of the ways to do it was to bribe MPs. to bribe MPs in order to get your way. You see, Britain was the first industrial nation. It had this extremely dynamic economic system that was creating huge amounts of wealth, but also huge amounts of disruption throughout the country. And one of the symptoms of this disruption were the deep tensions between the social classes. And that's what we're going to see in the next section. So far, we've seen that Britain before 1851 had an unpopular monarchy, which was rejuvenated by the arrival of Queen Victoria and her husband, and was the first industrial nation on earth. The third point of the background section of this lecture focuses on the tensions in that society that were centered around class. So if you turn to slide 14, we're going to look first at the dark side of industrialization. So I've told you about this extraordinary expansion of the economy in the industrial sector, and a number of the consequences of this were negative. So one negative consequence was mass unemployment, because of course new inventions make some jobs no longer relevant or no longer efficient. So a good example of this in the time we're talking about is the job of the hand loom weaver. So this is the man you see on the right, who has his own hand loom to weave at home. And yes, for those of you who are asking or wondering about it, yes, in the 19th century, this is a job that men do at home because it allows them to earn a good living. But as you can see, in the 30-year period between 1802 and 1832, they lost, their salaries collapsed from 21 shillings to 5 shillings a week. How did that happen, or why did that happen? Because somebody invented the power loom, a machine that could work a lot faster than an individual man could, a machine that was not powered by men or by a human, but powered by steam. Okay. A second negative consequence of industrialization were the working conditions, which were inhumane. We're talking about 16 hours a day for adults, up to 14 hours a day for 5-year-old children. And of course, when I say 16 hours a day, let's be very clear, we're not talking about 16 hours in an office. We're talking about 16 hours underground in the mines, or we're talking about 16 hours in those factories. The factories where there were power looms were extremely loud and noisy. It was very, very noisy in there. And people would become deaf at a very young age. In addition to that, the living conditions in the urban centers were also inhumane. So remember, I told you lots of people lost their jobs in the agricultural sector because of the new machines, and they went looking for work, and they migrated towards cities which were themselves located next to mines or next to factories in which cotton was being transformed into clothing. So those people flocked to the cities. The cities were not prepared to welcome them at all in terms of infrastructure. And so the living conditions of these people were dramatic. You had, as you can see in the table at the bottom on the right-hand corner, a city like Liverpool in a 30-year period grows by 120,000 people, which is enormous. Manchester similarly has an enormous growth. So that number of people in a 30-year period, the infrastructure is not capable of keeping up. And so the living conditions are atrocious. The way in which the city planning took place was also extremely brutal towards people who were poor. So all the districts in which people who were lower class were living were bulldozed through every time there was a big planning project, like bringing in a railway. So over 100,000 people were displaced by railways throughout the century. Their living, the places they lived in, the areas they lived in were destroyed to make room for the railway. A fourth element of industrialization that was problematic was the boom and bust economy. So economies generally go through cycles, and we are very aware of this ourselves, having living in a time when the economy has the latest bust was in 2008, and that was followed by years of austerity in Europe. And we were just recovering before COVID, so now that we have had COVID, the economy is tanking again. But without COVID, the economy just goes through cycles of boom and bust, of moments of expansion and moments of contraction. But in the 19th century, these are very steep, and there is no safety net. So you know that today, if you lose your job, you have unemployment benefits. But in the 19th century, these don't exist, at least not at the beginning of the century. So if the economy is doing well and you have a job, good for you. If the economy starts to tank, you then might lose your job. And once you've lost it, you have nothing. Okay, so there's huge job and wage insecurity for workers, and that creates many social calamities and difficulties. So how did the working class respond to this? Well, if you turn to slide 15, I have you have a number of dates and events and images there to remind you that the working classes didn't just passively accept these extremely difficult conditions. They regularly rebelled in various ways. One of them was to break the machines which were taking their jobs. Another was to have organized rioting. There were the Luddite riots at the beginning of the century. The Luddites were people who rejected the machines and broke them. There were the string riots. There were all of the rebellions of the so-called physical force Chartists that we talked about in the first lecture. They also, the working classes, tried to organize themselves through trade unions. So trade unions in French, ce sont les syndicats. And the first trade union was created in 1834, the first national one, which tried to consolidate all of the trade unions that existed. So a trade union would have been organized at the level of a particular group of workers. So let's say the trade union of all the miners, for instance. And the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union was an attempt to bring everyone together: the miners, the handloom weavers, and all the other workers. However, this was resisted by the employers, who basically told their employees, if you become a member of this Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, I will fire you. And at the time, there was no law protecting people from being fired for that reason. And so that's what happened. Perhaps the greatest movement of the working class was the one we've already discussed in the first lecture, the Chartist movement. So I won't go back on it, but you see that the Chartist movement, remember, goes from 1838 to 1848. Okay, and that movement is demanding political change, and 48 is just a few years before 1851. So the working class has been politicized, has become very skilled. It has a number of very skilled leaders, people who have been trained inside the Chartist movement, who have learned political skills from that movement. It has a following that is massive, of people who are aware of their working class condition, who are aware that they share this condition with others, and who are willing to fight together to improve their fate. But they wish, most of them, the immense majority of them, wish to fight in a peaceful manner to obtain reform rather than in a revolutionary manner. As you will know from Lecture 1, their efforts were not successful, but that doesn't mean people weren't noticing the working class uprisings. Particularly the Chartist movement caused a number of intellectuals, a number of politicians, a number of political figures to ask questions about their country and about the need or not for reform. And this is what was known at the time, and you find it on slide 16, as the debate called the Condition of England question. It was raised by intellectuals in the 1840s, particularly, or to begin with, the first one to do so was a man called Thomas Carlyle. He's the man you see at the top right-hand corner. Carlyle, in a book called Past and Present, asked himself how a nation that was so rich could be satisfied with having so many people working and living in such horrible conditions. He asked the question, is this really progress? Is this word progress not a word that is there to conceal, to hide the moral emptiness of this industrial civilization? And so, as you can see, he quotes. You can see the quote on the slide. England is full of wealth, of multifarious produce, supply for human want of every kind. Yet England is dying of inanition. So he was very concerned about this situation. Similarly concerned was the politician Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli was a conservative. If you might remember him from the second lecture, where I discussed how the Conservative Party was divided by Peel's decision to repeal the Corn Laws. Disraeli was on the side of those who were against the repeal of the Corn Laws, and after Peel and others like Gladstone left the Conservative Party to join the Liberals, Disraeli became very rapidly one of the leaders of the new Tory party, which was to become the Conservative Party. Disraeli was very concerned about the division between the rich and the poor that was occurring in Britain in the 1840s. In 1845, he published a book called Sibyl of the Two Nations, which was a novel. And in this novel, he told the story of a nation divided into two. And so he says, two nations, between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, the rich and the poor. His concern was that if the divisions between the rich and the poor became too steep and continued to rise, there would be a revolution. And he was very concerned about this, that there would be one. So he, as the leader of the Conservative Party, and this is something you will see in Lecture 5 with Monsieur Tellier, he put forward a platform called One Nation Toryism, or One Nation Conservatism, where he said we need to move back to one nation. We have to stop being two nations. And so this implies a form of paternalistic guidance from the upper class towards the working class, and not crushing them, but helping them. A third example of, or a third contributor to the condition of England question was the man at the bottom right of the slide, the man with the fabulous beard and mustache, Frederick Engels, who was a German businessman who lived in the United Kingdom. He was also an intellectual, and he was a very good friend of Karl Marx. And he wrote a book that was called The Condition of the Working Class in England, in which he tried very meticulously to chronicle the life of ordinary men and women working in Manchester, in businesses like his own. He inherited a business from his family, a big business in Manchester, and he really tried to identify how workers lived and what experience they had, and tried to show that their living and working conditions were completely unacceptable. But he did this tried to do it in a very neutral manner by just describing their lives. And so, as you can see, he says the workers have taken it into their heads that they, with their busy hands, are the necessary, and the rich capitalists who do nothing, the surplus population. So this is his belief that the workers are becoming aware of their power in the economic system, because of course if they stop working, the whole system collapses, and that in a way the upper classes who own the means of production are, according to these workers and according to Engels, the parasites, the ones that are benefiting without doing much work from the work of the others, of the workers. And so in addition to giving a portrait of how difficult their life is, he's also making a prophecy that they will rebel, and he welcomes this rebellion. So there's lots of debate in the 1840s in intellectual circles among both people who are afraid of revolution and people who are in favor of it about the way in which things could turn out for Britain in the near future, given the upheaval within the working class, given how horrible their lives are, how difficult they are, and how rich the rich are compared to the poor. And yet, in 1848, there is something called the People's Spring in Europe, Le Printemps des Peuples. I discussed it briefly in lecture number 2. 50 different states in Europe saw their monarchs overthrown or their constitutions transformed, but Britain didn't. And so that raised a whole bunch of questions. Why, in this first industrial nation with so many tensions between the social classes, with so many mass movements of poor people, of lower class people demanding their rights, why did they not seize the opportunity of 1848 like so many other countries did? Why did that not happen? Okay, so that's where we are just before this great exhibition was organized. If you turn to slide 17, there's a summary of what I've been saying so far. In 1851, Britain appeared to itself and to the world, on the one hand, as a model of economic dynamism and political stability because the monarchy was still there, and there was no revolution compared to the neighbors on the European continent. And the Great Exhibition of 51 was remarkable precisely because it would showcase Britain's superiority to the rest of the world, and for a brief moment, it would unite a society that was divided. All right, so let's see how they did that by returning to the Great Exhibition of 51. This is slide 18, on which you see my outline for this section. There's two things I'm going to discuss: how the British model was put on display during the Great Exhibition on the one hand, and on the other hand, discuss the success that it represented. So if we start with slide 19, as you can see, I'm going to have 3 slides now about this British model, how it was on display in the Great Exhibition. So first of all, there is the idea that this is a model of political stability. So if you look at the opening day, and this is the image you have here on the right, the painting is the painting of the opening day. As you can see, it's very formal, very grandiose. And on that day, there was a mix of tradition and modernity. Tradition on the one hand, because you had Queen Victoria who opened the event with the national anthem and Rule Britannia being sung, and the Archbishop of Canterbury leading prayers. So that is very much the sort of traditional establishment of the British crown leading the way. But it went hand in hand with tremendous doses of modernity. On the one hand, a brand new police force, the Metropolitan Police, which had been created in 1829 and which, without having any weapons, without being an army force, without having any weapons, managed to skillfully police the event. It did so by recruiting 1,000 men who were there to make sure that the so-called dangerous classes didn't cause any trouble, and to keep an eye particularly on the European revolutionaries who had all found refuge in London, which was a very welcoming city for all the revolutionary figures of Europe at the time. People like Karl Marx ended up in London because they were kicked out of Prussia for criticizing the German emperor. The Metropolitan Police, in order to make sure there wasn't also a threat from outside revolutionaries coming into the big event, worked closely with the different police forces of the continent. And as a result of all of this, they were extremely successful. So the model of political stability shows through in this mix of the traditional features of the state with its more modern forces. On slide 20, we see the second dimension of this successful model. It's the centerpiece It's the centerpiece, of course, of the exhibition, which is a model of technological innovation and economic dynamism. So the goal was to show off to the rest of the world Britain's industrial prowess. And so what they did was they showcased, on the one hand, the advantages they had in terms of their natural resources. And so you see on the right, there's a young man there standing next to a lump of coal. Now, I don't know about you, but I have to confess, if I was told, Mark, this weekend, let's go to the museum, there's a lump of coal, I wouldn't go. I would say, no, I don't want to see a lump of coal. But coal, remember, is the source of energy of this fascinating industrial revolution that people are living through, and so there is a fascination with this natural element. They also want to show their superiority in terms of their technological expertise, and so there are, as you can see at the bottom on the right-hand side there, large industrial machines at the Great Exhibition that people can just look at and visit and see and be in awe of. Of course, the Crystal Palace itself is an example of the superiority of British engineering because, as I said at the very beginning, 9 months to build a huge structure like that. And the only reason they could do that is because they were innovative in the kinds of materials they used that were much lighter than the usual brick and mortar. As I said also at the beginning, half of the exhibits were from Britain and her empire, which also shows off the power of Britain and the wealth of Britain. There is the famous Indian diamond that you could see in the very first slide, which was one of the great attractions of the event. Okay, and let's turn now to slide 21, where we have the third dimension of the British model that was demonstrated by the event. This is the idea that Britain is a model of social harmony. Now, I told you that is definitely not the case. Before 1851, Britain is not a model of social harmony. Okay, but this event, this great exhibition, creates a moment of social harmony. You are all too young to remember this, but I was alive in 1998 when France won the World Cup, the Football World Cup. And at the time, there was a brief moment of national unity around the notion of La France Black Blanc Beurre. There was this sort of national moment of national reconciliation and joy at being French, where everybody was so happy to be part of this winning nation that won the World Cup. It didn't last very long, but before the World Cup and after the World Cup, we were divided and bickering and in disagreement. But during that brief moment, there was a moment of national unity and harmony. And that's exactly what you have with the Great Exhibition. So how did they make it such a success in generating this feeling of pride, of national pride and of national unity? Well, one of the ways was through the system of ticket pricing. The organizers were very clever in that they decided to have different prices for different days. So that if you were a lower class person, you could come on days that were cheaper. And if you were an upper class person who didn't want to mingle with or to have so many people visiting at the same time as you, you could pay to visit on the days that were more expensive. So this created an environment where everybody could go. You weren't limited by your resources. The railways, of course, helped this to become a popular phenomenon because people could go with the famous third-class fares that I talked about, with trains that were slower and less comfortable, but they would get there eventually. And finally, because the event was so popular, there was a big movement of solidarity where people decided to raise money to help children in their area, for instance, to go with their teachers to the Great Exhibition as a sort of treat, a great opportunity for them to take part in this very popular event. The result of this system was that a feeling of national pride was generated, and there was an unusual mixing of the social classes, because a lot of people, for the first time in their lives, went somewhere and to London, but left their homes, left they were the first, for a lot of people, they were the first of their family to ever leave the county that they were from. And to everyone's surprise at the time, there are lots of commentators at the time who are just very pleasantly surprised that rich and poor manage to mingle in this space and nothing bad happens. People are friendly to one another. People are happy. People are smiling. There's no unpleasantness. Okay. So the result was a unifying event. It generated this sense of national pride, and it seemed to prove that ultimately it was possible to live in social harmony. What is more, and this is slide 22, it was a huge success including in terms of its legacy. So not only was it a success at the time, at the moment of its taking place, it turned a profit, which is very rare for these kinds of big events today. As you know, every time the Olympic Games happen, the city that organizes them goes broke. So that event was not like that. The Great Exhibition made money for those who organized it. In addition to that, it left a big legacy in London. Now, those of you who've been to London will perhaps know this area. If you go to the area of Kensington and Chelsea, you have a whole series of big buildings that are all the product of the investments that were made after the Great Exhibition, thanks to the money raised by the government in a number of buildings that became the Science Museum, the National History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Imperial College of Science, Royal College of Arts, and the Albert Hall. Okay? So all of that is quite impressive. The Crystal Palace itself, which was a beautiful, magnificent building, was moved from Hyde Park to Sydenham. That's the area that is now associated with the football club Crystal Palace. Unfortunately, the building burnt down in 1936 and was not rebuilt because it had gone into decrepitude. Basically, nobody really was still using it. It was just too big and no longer useful. But still, the success of the exhibition seemed to perfectly capture the strengths of this British model, and they explain, and they're a useful marker. They're a useful marker for what happened afterwards, which was that after the 1851 through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Britain would become the world's superpower. Okay, so that's what I want to turn to now. So let's turn now to the aftermath of the Great Exhibition. It was followed by 2 decades of economic prosperity and improvements to the lives of the working classes. And at the same time as those 2 developments, the monarchy was becoming increasingly strengthened under Albert and Victoria, and then under Victoria alone after Albert's death. So that's the outline that you find on slide 23 for this aftermath section between 51 and 73. I've entitled it England's Summer. It's the moment when England is at the apex of her power. So let's have a look at first how the monarchy was strengthened. So this is slide 24 and 25. So on slide 25 is the outline for this for the various key moments of this strengthening. First, there's those 10 years after 51, in which Victoria and Albert emerge from the Great Exhibition as a modern couple, modern rulers who embrace the middle classes. So as I told you before, they become aligned with the middle class and its values, which is a shift from before when the monarchy was aligned rather with the aristocracy. This tells you something about the rising force that is the middle class, which is the social class that is on the rise in society, the one that everybody aspires to emulate. And so the monarchs are being very, very clever in aligning themselves with this new force. So how does this manifest itself? It manifests itself in the defense the monarchs make of economic liberalism, but also in their attempt to champion reform of the working and living conditions of ordinary workers. This is again the work of Albert, who becomes the president of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Laboring Classes. And this is a clear attempt by the monarchy to signal that it is aware that the workers are suffering and that it believes something needs to change. And this is in line with the middle class. Some of you might be thinking, but surely the middle class was opposed to the working classes. This was definitely the case before the 1850s. We saw this very clearly when we talked both about the Great Reform Act and about the Great Famine. But after the 1850s, there is a change in the dominant opinion in the middle classes, where an increasing number of people in those classes start to recognize the difficulties and the hardships endured by the workers, and start to become active exponents of the idea that something has to be done to improve their lives. The second period of this strengthening of the monarchy is between 61 and 72. 61 is the death of Albert, a premature death. And Victoria was so sad and in such deep mourning that she decided, or she maybe didn't, I'm not sure it was a decision. She found herself in a situation where she felt she could not continue to be so present in public life as she was when her husband was alive. So she secludes herself in a long period of mourning, which leads, of course, to a detachment of the monarchy from, even more than before, from the day-to-day of British politics, leaving the scene open for the main middle-class politicians, Disraeli and Gladstone, to become the big figures of British politics, and the monarch now seeming to be very much secluded in her various residences and floating a little bit above the political fray. In 1867, when Disraeli is in power with the Conservatives, he's not prime minister, but he's a key figure in the government, and he pushes the Conservatives to introduce the Second Reform Act, which we discussed when we talked about the Great Reform Act of 32. So we talked about the Reform Act of 67. That Reform Act increased the number of voters. It made it much harder for the monarch to intervene in the process as they did before, and it starts to constitute a political system around the political parties trying to win votes. Without cheating, without buying beer for everyone, but actually trying to convince the voters. In 1867, a famous journalist, Walter Bagehot, published a book that talked about the English Constitution. It's still a classic today. It's an attempt to explain how the United Kingdom's political system works. Remember that the English do not have a formal constitution like we do. We have a Constitution de la Cinquième République, or like the United States has this constitution that they've always had, that they've brought different amendments to. The British don't have a formal constitution, and so writing a book about the constitution is a way, using the term constitution not in the sense of a written document, but in the sense of the different elements that make up the political system of the UK. And in that book, he said the monarchy is in fact the dignified part of the constitution. Everything else is the efficient part, the government, the parliament. But the monarch is the dignified part. That is to say, it's all about the show. It's all about the theater. Okay, so that's the model that this monarchy is moving towards. And in the final part of Victoria's reign, between 1702 and 1901, Victoria gradually becomes the symbol of the nation. In 1872, as you can see, a man called Arthur O'Connor tried to assassinate the Queen. This created, as always, these things. Every time somebody tries to assassinate a ruler, the person trying to do the assassinating really believes that they are freeing the country from this awful tyrant. But what really happens is that they usually fail. And when they fail, the tyrant that they thought they were targeting is even more appreciated, if she wasn't already, by the people in the country. So huge support for her after this attempt. It was not the first attempt. She was the target of 7 different assassination attempts throughout her life. 4 years later, in 1876, Disraeli, who was very keen on the empire, made her Empress of India, which was a big publicity stunt. She went to India, she rode an elephant, everybody was very impressed. There were photos all over the press of the world. So she becomes a sort of symbol that not only is at the head of the nation, but the head of an empire. There were then jubilees for her in 1887 and 1897, golden and diamond jubilees, so big celebrations where people commemorated her and congratulated her on her reign. So this cemented further her status as a sort of an incarnation of the nation. And in 1901, when she passed away, the monarchy, which was very fragile when she came to the throne, now was extremely strong in its standing among the people as a symbol of both the state on the one hand, as it had always been, and of the nation on the other. Okay, so in the aftermath of the Great Exhibition, the monarchy becomes very much a strong, even if much less powerful, but a very stable institution, one that was no longer contested. What about the industrial nation? Well, this is slide 26. The monarch, this monarch, which is a very stable monarch, is now at the head of the workshop of the world. That was the name given to Britain in the 19th century, after the 1850s. Now, why is that? So we come back to the drivers of economic success and economic superiority. So what are these drivers? Again, there's a number of them, and they don't feed into one another in a sort of causal connection, but they are feeding each other in a sort of loop. So first of all, you've got demographic growth. There's 4 million extra people in the country in this period. So again, the domestic demand is increased. What is more, farming, remember I told you the British were the first to have this agricultural revolution, which created a much more productive agricultural sector. Well, it becomes even more productive through the period of what was called high farming, which is the name given to the new scientific farming techniques, where you use fertilizer and you use even more machines. And as a result, you got what people called the golden age of British agriculture, where productivity was extremely high. The fact that there were more people meant the markets were larger, which meant the prices went up and the profits went up. The competition from the foreigners was limited because the rest of the world, on the one hand, was less well developed agriculturally than Britain, but also on the other hand had no way to ship its goods to Britain because the ships were too slow for the goods to get to Britain on time without perishing, and there was no refrigeration capacity, or a limited one, so you couldn't bring food that was raw from different parts of the world. But that's going to change, as we will see. A third key factor in Britain's economic superiority was the work of Gladstone. Gladstone, as I pointed out in lecture 2, came to government many times, not only as prime minister, but he was often in governments where he was chancellor of the exchequer and in other jobs. And every time he got a chance, he would bring down tariffs. So he played a key role in making Britain increasingly a free trade nation, and this free trade policies encouraged and stimulated the economy. Fourth point on this slide, the export boom. As you can see, in the 20-year period between 51 and 71, trade and transport grow from 19% of GDP to 25%. That's quite a big leap, and that shows you how dynamic the exportations are. Okay, so that's why Britain becomes known as the workshop of the world, because there's so many things being exported. You know how today everything we have in our homes seems to be made in China. Well, in the 19th century, many of the products people buy seem to be made in Britain. On the next slide, slide 28, we have a number of other drivers of Britain's economic superiority. So in this period, we continue to have new inventions. For instance, Harry Bessemer in 1865 invests a system for making large quantities of steel at much lower prices, so that's going to, again, stimulate the economy. The railway boom continued in this period between 51 and the 70s. As you can see, the number of miles of tracks increased. The number of passengers was multiplied by 3. And there were new modes of transportation, including the first underground railway, the tube system, emerges in the 1860s. Another driver are the steamships. So the sailing ships, tous les navires à voile, are replaced by steamships, which are more reliable because if you have no wind, the sailing ship stops. But even if you have no wind, the steamship continues. So you're no longer dependent on wind to travel, and you're no longer dependent on wind for your trade. So it becomes a much more reliable way of getting goods shipped across the world. And Britain becomes a world leader in this, in steamships, and starts exporting those as well. So they were world leaders for railway, they become world leaders in steamships. A final driver of Britain's economic superiority were the gold rushes that happened in California, Australia, and New Zealand between 49 and 61, which all brought a flood of currency onto the market. There was lots of money that could be invested in all of these big projects that they were carrying out. So the combined result of all of this was extremely good for workers, who saw real improvements in their earnings. So as you can see, they saw their average wage go up by 50% in the 25 years between 50 and 75, and this was 30% higher than inflation. The inflation was only 20%. So what this means is their real wage increase was considerable. A 30% increase. If tomorrow the Emmanuel Macron announced that university teachers were going to be paid 30% more, I would be extremely happy, to say the least. Okay, so as you can see, Britain's, as the workshop of the world, becomes this economic powerhouse, which is really good news for the working classes financially. And another piece of good news for them is that, as I said, thanks in part to the efforts of Albert, and in large part to the mobilization of the working classes themselves, and to the increasing realization in the middle classes that something had to be done for these people. We see Britain in the period between 51 and 70 becoming increasingly attentive to the interests of the working class. So this is what we see on slide 29 and 30. So if you turn to slide 30, this is a rather difficult area for me to summarize because there's lots and lots of attempts to bring solutions to the problems that are faced by workers. So what I've tried to do is to synthesize the main points into these 3 headings. Okay, so on the one hand, there are all of the Factory and Mines Acts. These are acts of Parliament that are passed on a very regular basis. So from the 1810s all the way to the end of the century, on a very regular basis, you have a new Factory Act or a new Mine Act. Some of them are not very good, not very helpful. Others make a tremendous difference to people's lives. All of them have as their stated objective to regulate the working conditions, to make life less hard on workers in their professional environments. And so typically from one act to the next, what happens is you see the number of hours per day that people have to work come down. So the law starts to say, no, we can't have people working 16 hours a day in a mine. We have to bring it down to something more reasonable. They regularly increase the age at which you're supposed to begin working. So no, we can't have 5-year-old children working. And they regularly try to strengthen the inspection system so that employers are obliged to respect those rules. Now, let's be very clear, and let's not put some rose-tinted glasses when we look at this phenomenon. The number of hours was still very high. The age at which children started was still very young, and the inspection system was rarely efficient. There were very few inspectors and too many places to inspect. But still, there's a general trend throughout the century of bringing down the number of hours, bringing up the age of the children, and increasing and improving the inspection system. The second heading I've got on my slide is public health. So one of the big problems was that the cities were extremely filthy and they were infected with deadly diseases like cholera. There were cholera epidemics that killed people. 90,000 people between 48 and 49 were killed by cholera. Compare that to what we are experiencing now with COVID. As you know, in France at the moment, we're about 30,000 dead over a 7-month period. It'll be a year next March. We'll see where we are then, and hopefully it won't be too high. But it gives you a sense of the proportion. And so there's, again, a series of acts of parliament called the Sanitation Acts, which are passed with a view to improving the living conditions of people, and particularly of getting rid of the filth of the city. So you have the first sewage systems, les égouts, that are brought in. You have the first clean water that is piped into people's houses, and there are regular efforts to destroy slums, les bidonvilles, to destroy them and create more modern houses that are better but that provide better sanitary conditions. So the final heading I've introduced up on the slide is public education. That's because one of the things that politicians and intellectuals, middle-class people start to say is voters deserve the right to vote. They need to be able to vote so that they can defend their interests. However, we don't want them to vote if they are illiterate. We don't want them to vote if they haven't had an education, because we fear that if they're uneducated, they will make poor voters, poor quality voters who will vote for any ideologue or any demagogue that walks through the door. That's why you have the Education Act of 1870, Foster's Education Act, which makes elementary education more readily accessible to all, to make sure that the children of the working classes, which can now vote, are educated. But the good times, unfortunately, would not last. And so this brings me to the final section of this lecture, the conclusion that I've entitled, Your English Summer's Done. Now that, as you can see, I've put that in quotation marks because that's a famous quote from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, who in this poem laments the end of Britain's domination of the world. If we look back with the hindsight, we can date the beginning of the decline to the beginning of the 1870s, when there is an economic depression, a Great Depression that hits the world economy. And simultaneously, there is the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, which is going to give an advantage to other nations industrially, nations that are in particular Germany and the United States, which will take the lead in that Second Industrial Revolution and as a result become challengers to Britain's economic superiority, challengers who will then take over and become the new economic leaders of the world. So that's the outline for this lecture. There is first the agricultural decline of Britain, followed by the industrial decline of Britain, and as a result of more difficult economic times, the return of working class politics, the return of class conflict after 20 years, not of complete peace, but of a relative peace brought by economic affluence and the improvement of the conditions of workers. So let's turn to slide 32, where we talk about first the agricultural decline of Britain. So why did Britain suffer agricultural decline at the beginning of the 1870s? Well, first of all, there was some really bad weather, which is one of the difficulties with agriculture, is that you can be the best farmer in the world, but if the weather sucks, you're going to suffer. And so between 1873 and 1877, that's 4 years in a row, there's really bad weather, and so the crops are ruined and the animals suffer from diseases. So that's going to hit you in terms of your economic profits. In addition to that, the railways, which are now transcontinental, so they're very vast tracts of land that are now with railways, and the trains traverse entire continents, and then put all of the products that they have on there in the train onto steamships, which bring the goods that were fabricated in these in places like North and South America to Europe. And this causes the European farmers to be in great difficulty because the products coming from North and South America are in vast quantities and they are very good quality. So they put a lot of competition on the market and they make the prices come down. And if the prices come down, as a farmer, you're making less money. To make things worse, in the 1880s, people started making refrigerated ships, and that meant that you could bring meat from South America, in Argentina in particular, but also from New Zealand, to the United Kingdom, and this put pressure on farmers as well. Finally, Disraeli, who you will remember had been a champion of mercantilism in 1846 when he rejected the repeal of the Corn Laws, when he resisted the repeal of the Corn Laws, Disraeli refused to, when he became prime minister, refused to reintroduce protectionist policies. He accepted that laissez-faire was now the economic dogma of Britain. So this meant there was no protection for the farmers from foreign competition. What were the results? Well, there was a social result, mass unemployment of agricultural laborers. So agricultural laborers in 1851, there were 2 million of them. By 1901, there's only 600,000 left. So that's a big drop in 50 years of 1.4 million jobs that disappeared. They were no longer needed. So those people need to find employment elsewhere. A political consequence is that people who have a medium or a small amount of land, the landowners, they are no longer able to engage in politics because their land is not generating enough revenue to allow them to be in politics. They need to earn money regularly, so they need to have they need to have some kind of occupation that allows them to make money. And so they can't go into politics. As a result, they are gradually replaced by those who are rich enough to be in parliament all the time because of the wealth they have made. And those are the middle class businessmen. So sociologically, the House of Commons shifts away from the aristocracy towards the middle class. And finally, there's an economic consequence. Because there are no tariffs on agricultural products, the food is cheap. And this is good for urban workers because it means that their high wages are not completely invested or completely spent on food. They have enough money to spend on other things. Okay? So that's the agricultural decline. What about the industrial decline, which you find on slide 33? So as I said, this is caused by the Second Industrial Revolution. So, and other things, but that's one of the main factors. So let's look at the 4 reasons that are on the slide. First of all, the railways, which had been such a driver of British economic and industrial expansion, of course, after a while, you don't need any more train tracks. There's a point at which you've had enough. There's no need to put another train track. And so the demand for trains slows down, which slows down the entire economy. Because remember, I told you at one point, hundreds of thousands of people are working on building train tracks and building trains. But once you have those, then you don't need as many people. So that, again, unemployment comes from there. In addition, as I said, there's this second industrial revolution where there's these new industries, chemistry, electricity, and automobiles. These new industries have their birthplaces and their first sort of leaders in other countries, in the USA and in Germany. They take the lead in these new industries, and Britain falls behind because they're trying to play catch up. So the British industrial sector, which was at the cutting edge, is now behind its competitors, and because it was the first industrial nation, it's also now the nation that has the oldest factories, the oldest machines, and that takes a lot of capital to transform. And so, interestingly, what used to be a big advantage to be the first on the market is now a disadvantage because they can't renew their industrial machinery fast enough to keep up with the competition. Finally, the British suffer from the policies of other countries. In France, in the USA, but also in Germany, Britain's competitors introduce tariffs. And they say, we are now going to put taxes on the stuff we import from Britain. So this means it's harder for the British to export. But the British governments refuse to do the same thing the other way. And so they agree to keep the tariffs very low for their competitors, which means that French, German, and American and other competitors sell their goods in Britain without having to pay a tax, so they compete with the British British industrialists without taxes, so they can bring the prices down. They can compete on a level playing field, while British industrialists face the difficulties on the other side of selling their products, but with tariffs on them already, so it's harder to compete. Okay, so the result of all of this was that by 1914, Britain was third in the production of manufactured goods. So it was no longer the workshop of the world. The workshop of the world was now a mix of Britain, USA, and Germany. Okay, so agricultural decline, industrial decline, all of this leads to more hardship for the working classes. And so, slide 34, the working classes start once again to be to organize themselves in order to defend their interests. Their principal method or weapon or mode of organizing is the trade unions. And what's new about the end of the century, so from the 1870s onwards, is that the non-skilled workers who are not skilled, so that is to say, ordinary workers, not the ones who have a special skill that makes them valuable in the job market, those workers decide to organize their own trade unions. Now that's new because in the past the trade unions were essentially unions of skilled workers, and those workers used their special position on the job market to negotiate better terms for themselves. The unskilled workers weren't organized in this way, but when they do become organized, they become a very powerful force because there's a lot of them, a lot more than the skilled workers. So they're a very potent force on the market if they manage to organize themselves. And so there are mass demonstrations that they organize in 1886 and 87. They have one of the most efficient strikes in 89, the London Dockers. Okay, leading to the unskilled workers becoming unionized, and this leads then to the creation of the TUC, the Trade Union Congress. This is a very important event because the TUC still exists today. It's the one big organization that unites all the trade unions of the country, and they make very clear demands that are associated at the time with a movement called socialism, where they say we want 8-hour work days, we want mines and railways to be nationalized. The idea being that you should nationalize the things that are essential to everyday life. And the mines and the railways were essential to the running of the British economy. And so they felt this should be in common ownership. The nation should be the owner, not individual private enterprises. Okay, that's a typical socialist argument. So those demands found an echo, interestingly, in middle class socialist organizations. So I've given 3 here just to give you an idea. There's a whole bunch of organizations, but the 3 most significant ones are the Social Democratic Federation of Henry Heinemann, the Socialist League of William Morris, and the Fabian Society of Beatrice and Sidney Webb. All 3 of these organizations had different agendas and different philosophies. As one of was Marxist, another one was anarchist, and a third one was gradualist, which means they were reformist. They were people who wanted gradual reform. But what they all have in common is a belief that a socialist view of society was the best option. They didn't quite agree on what that was and exactly how it should be implemented, but they have a view that you should implement policies that are in favor of the workers because they are the mass of the people. They are the most important component of society, and so society should be turned towards their needs and organized around making their lives, their living conditions better. These middle-class groups, as well as the trade unions, would come to work with a new political party that was founded by a miner called Keir Hardie, a man who was from Scotland, and who was elected in 1892. He was the only working-class person in the House of Commons, and he was the only socialist in the House of Commons at the time. In 1895, he, with his Independent Labour Party, went to the election, and generally speaking, the election was a failure. As a result, he tried to think how to work differently, and he created something else called the Labour Representation Committee, in which he tried to organize all of the sympathizers for the socialist cause into one big organization. And he brought together the Trade Union Congress, the organizations, the middle-class organizations I mentioned, and his Independent Labour Party. And in 1906, they had a breakthrough general election where 29 of the 50 people they presented were elected to the House of Commons. And in 1906, they became the Labour Party, which would become the main party of opposition to the Conservative Party after the First World War. So very rapidly, this would become the main party, and this is something you will see with my colleagues when you study the 20th century. So this brings me to the end of the lecture, to slide 35, where you see there is a bibliography of specific passages of different books that you can go and read if you want to find out more about this particular lecture, the themes that I've discussed in this particular lecture. I really encourage you once again to listen to the BBC Radio 4 podcast on the Great Exhibition. These are always extremely well done and extremely helpful to listen to. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope you found this helpful. And of course, as always, please don't hesitate to post your questions on Ametis about this lecture if you have any, and I'll be very happy to respond.